Hello and welcome to Depression 1 Recovery 1930 to 1951. We're still on key question 2, life during the Depression, but today we're going to look at making ends meet and self-help. So what I want you to think about first is, this table shows the weekly spending of a family of an unemployed textile worker in Lancashire in 1931. Their weekly dole payment was £1.15 at 9. Okay, so about £70 a week. What do you think this meant life was like during the Depression for these people? So just a few bullet points. Have a little look at that weekly spending and you tell me now what you think life was like for people during the Depression. Okay, so have a little look there and make some notes. Pause the video and come back to me. So hopefully you've done that now and you're thinking about the fact that it was very difficult. The money was stretched really thinly. Savings club there, the 5p a savings club, that would go by the by if there was other things that needed paying for. That union and insurance would only really cover the worker, so if there was a healthcare problem it would only be covered for the worker, not for the children and the mother. Milk and bread was staple diets and margarine was staple. Meat, if they were lucky they would get meat, and again clog irons if they needed it as well, quite often, just because they couldn't afford new shoes. So it was very, very difficult. So making ends meet and self-help is what we're going to look at today. So what were these things? What were making ends meet and self-help? What do we mean by these? In the areas of Britain where the old industries have grown, such as the northeast of England, South Wales, central Scotland, the Depression led to very, very high levels of unemployment. Sometimes it was over 50%. If you remember when we did the Jarrow Crusade, Palmer's shipyard in Jarrow, when that closed, that caused an unemployment rate of 80% in the town. So 80% of the people in that town didn't have jobs, which meant that they were living below the poverty line. And this was the case in lots and lots of different towns. It often led to a fall in the standard of living and health of the families of those out of work. So you can see this is an example of a house in the 30s in Merthyr Tydfil. Their mother there is patching up a hole in the floor. So what I want you to do is take a double page in your book and create a spider diagram, and it's going to have poverty and diet, women, children and self-help. I'm going to go through some slides now to providing you with some information on these things, and what I want you to do is make notes around your spider diagram as I go. So make notes around the poverty and diet, around women, children and self-help for me, please. Again, pause and stop as you need with this video. So again, I suggest you pause, get these down, and then I can continue. So poverty and diet to start with. So in York at the beginning of the 20th century, 30% of people lived below the poverty line. This was the same in 1936. So in 1900, 30% of people lived below the poverty line, and it was the same in 1936. They were living in Victorian standard of living, which was not very good at all. The rest of the country really had to come up to that point, and it was a really terrible place to live at the time. 72% of unemployment workers lived below the poverty line. So the poverty line is what is considered not adequate food and money to live properly, not sufficient food to keep your for your nutritional daily intake, which is very, very unhealthy. They had less money to spend on the bare essentials. A survey in Stockton-on-Tees showed that a poor family was likely to spend only 3 shillings, while a richer family would spend at least 6 shillings. So £7.60 compared to £15.20 today. John Boyd Orr in 1936 published the results of a survey into the diet and health of the British people, and he said that 4.5 million people, that's more than the amount of people that live in Wales today, had a diet that was inadequate. So they weren't getting the nutritional intake that they needed. They weren't eating enough food. 5 million people had some kind of deficiency caused by malnutrition or poverty, and 1 in 10 in the population was seriously undernourished. A fifth of all children, that included as well. Families of the unemployed ate a lot of bread, margarine and potato and sugar and tea, but little meat, barely any vegetables and no fruit and milk, because they just couldn't afford it. The diets of wives and mothers are the worst. They sacrificed their own needs quite often for those of their husbands and children, because the children needed food because they were children, the men needed food because they needed to go to work. So the wives quite often suffered. So women. Making ends meet probably had the biggest impact on women, as we've discussed this very briefly in previous lessons. They're generally the first to be laid off work. So if they're in a factory, there are women working, and the jobs are going sparse, and the factory needs to cut down on its outgoings, the women were the first to go. lots and lots of women then go into domestic service. Now, domestic service was a very, very difficult job. It wasn't always working in your Downton Abbey, massive houses, mansions kind of thing. Quite often you would work for a middle class family and you'd be a maid of all work, or sometimes you could be a farmhand, a domestic servant or a farmhand, which was very heavy work, getting up early, very, very difficult work as well. National insurance didn't cover women. It normally only covered the worker, and so they were not covered for medical treatment. So quite often they would be the first to pass away because they would have lots of conditions that were left untreated, and they would sacrifice themselves quite often. The death rate for women between 15 and 35 was more than twice as high in high areas of unemployment between 31 and 35. So a very, very difficult life for women in the 1930s. Children, poor diet leads to really high infant mortality rates, so lots of deaths in children, and the health of children in the depressed areas. In the 1930s, for every 3 children from rich families that died young, there's 8 children from poorer families. So the children of the poor really, really are suffering. A third of children in Newcastle in 1933, Newcastle's a really industrial area, were physically unfit because of poor health, and they were 10 times more likely to catch bronchiolitis, 8 times more likely to catch pneumonia, 5 times more likely to suffer from rickets, which is a disease of the bones that is caused by malnutrition. So children as well in the depressed areas, really high mortality rate, not really known to live much further than their 10th birthday, sometimes even younger than that. Looking after babies was very difficult. Getting a baby to its first birthday was difficult because there was no milk. With regards to breastfeeding, women weren't healthy enough to do that, so that wasn't a viable option either. Formula was expensive to buy, milk was expensive to buy, so babies quite often suffered because of malnutrition as well. So what is self-help? So self-help, basically, it was communities helping themselves. Women opened credit mechanisms for pawning goods, paying rent, buying food and clothing, so they'd put stuff on tick, basically. They'd pay it off bit by bit, week by week. Neighbours would rally round in times of crisis. For example, there'd be childbirth. The women would help each other out during childbirth. There'd be intrusion by rent collectors or the police sometimes, and the community would rally round to help that stop happening. They'd come down really harshly on those that didn't stick with the community and broke those unwritten conventions. There was unemployed clubs set up by churches and mayor funds. Central Advisory for Unemployed Workers in 1932. There was an increase in educational opportunities for the unemployed. And there was a British Book Appeal as well by the British Library. Now, quite a lot of the coal miners would go to the workers' institutes, the miners' institutes, where there was big libraries, and they would educate themselves and read and things like that as well to try and better their prospects. So this is just a way that the people in the communities help themselves. Quite often because the government, in some respects, had forgotten about them. And they weren't being helped at all, and so they had to put things in place for themselves. They had to do something, and so these are the kinds of things that they did. Right, I want you to have a go now, an exam question. This is exam question 4, the links question, and it's explain the connections between any 3 of the following: the Depression, hunger marches, making ends meet, and self-help. How do I answer this question? Well, what we do is we make sure that we're talking about the links. You can tell me briefly what they are, but you're not getting marks for describing what the Depression was, for describing what the hunger marches was. You were explaining the relevant connections. You can do this in a couple of ways. You can say the Depression is linked to the hunger marches because of this, 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 and this. The Depression is linking to make ends meet because of this, 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 and this. Hunger marches is linked to making ends meet because of this, 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 and this. It's totally up to you. Or you can do it in one sort of big paragraph. Don't be fooled into thinking this has got to be a really long answer. It hasn't. You've just got to describe the links, okay? People fall into the trap of thinking because it's a 12 marker, you've got to have a massive answer. You really don't. So have a go at that for me, and the mark scheme is there for you. I'd like you to give you a mark after that as well, and bring it in for me when you are next in. Thank you very much. That's it for today.